Hello and welcome to lesson 5 of our Jungle Book case study. Today we're ready to start looking at the 1967 animation and the historical and economic contexts. First of all, some retrieval practice. Today it's all about practicing the key terms you've learned so far. In a moment you can pause the video, write down the numbers 1 to 5 and then write down what you think is the correct key term to match the definition. Okay, let's go through and mark those then. Number 1, star power. That refers to the use of well-known actors and actresses in lead roles within a film. Number 2 is monopoly. We know that's having exclusive ownership or control over something. And number 3 was conglomerate. Disney, we know, is a large corporation which owns a range of smaller companies. Those smaller companies then are number 4, they're known as subsidiaries. And 5, the answer was synergy, the increased effectiveness that results when 2 or more people or businesses work together. And I gave you that great example of Disney using all of its brands, all of the things that it owns, its smaller subsidiaries, to promote the release of Disney Plus on Twitter. So today's lesson focus, we're interested in the 1967 Jungle Book film. We want to be applying our industry knowledge so far, so everything that we've looked at over the last 4 sessions is going to be really helpful in aiding our understanding. So far we've looked at the film industry and the processes involved in the film chain and the making of movies. We've looked at ownership and control in the film industry, understanding the big 5 and who really holds the most power over the film industry. Number 3, we looked at Curran and Seaton's theory then about profit and power within media industries altogether, and we applied that to the film industry. And our last session we looked at Hesmondhal's ideas about cultural industries, and there we looked at ideas of profitability and risk, considering how film was a risky business. Today then we're ready to look at the 1967 animation, focusing firstly on contexts and again getting that background information that might be really helpful for understanding the media product. When we're looking at the context of any film, we need to be aware that that media product will represent ideas, ways of thinking, events from the era in which it was produced in. So the era of the Jungle Book was an era of change, both in the social historical context as well as within the film industry itself. And our job within media studies is to begin to explain how these contexts might affect the production of a film, the making of it. Okay, so the first thing I think we need to look at is Disney as a company and a brand, and how it evolved from its origins in 1923 right the way through to 1967 when the Jungle Book is released. You can see here I've created a bit of a crude timeline, but I think it's really helpful to have the understanding of how Disney has evolved first before we look at any other historical economic contexts. Okay, so in 1923, Disney first begins as a small cartoon studio owned by brothers Walt Disney and Roy Disney. Over time that evolves to become the Walt Disney Studio, and by 1928 we have the creation of Mickey Mouse and that very short cartoon that's very well known, Steamboat Willie. And by the 1930s we've got the creation of Mickey Mouse's friends such as Pluto, Donald Duck, Goofy. It's 1937 then that becomes a significant date in the evolution of Disney's history. It's here that they make their first full-length animation, and that is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And Disney continue with the popularity and success of this film, making further animated classics such as Pinocchio, Dumbo, Bambi, through the 1940s. By this point, Disney is really expanding as a company, creating huge studios and a backlot where they're able to control all aspects of production. By 1948, Disney is making more what we would call now live-action texts. Songs of the South is perhaps the first that combines animation and live-action. But the significant text here comes in 1950, and that is the release of Treasure Island, which we can see as their first fully live-action feature. Alongside this, Disney continues to make those animated films which they have become absolutely specialist in. And we see classics such as Cinderella, Peter Pan being created. It's at this point that they're also breaking out into another medium. Disney are now producing television shows as well. And by 1955, they've branched out even more. Walt Disney creating Disneyland and opening the first of his theme parks in California. Throughout the 1950s, films continue to be made, and we see further animated classics such as Sword in the Stone and 101 Dalmatians. By 1967 then, Walt Disney is working on what will be the last movie that he is involved with before his death. That's The Jungle Book. At this time, Walt Disney World is also being created in Florida, and it's being constructed in 1967. So we can see here that by the time we get to looking at The Jungle Book, Disney has already quite a long history as a highly successful and specialised institution that's focused on creating very high quality animated movies, but has also begun to branch out into television and diversify into theme parks by this point as well. So it's a well-known and popular brand by the time that The Jungle Book is released. Okay, so let's have a look at the wider historical context of the 1960s. And there are some big social, political things that are happening throughout this decade that we want to be aware of. We don't have to talk in depth about them, but they do help, again, to kind of place Disney's decision-making and the types of things that they were creating at this time. If we were in class right now, I'd be playing this short clip. It's a short video called Sound Smart, the 1960s, where it runs through a brief timeline and overview of some of those really significant events, things like the Black Civil Rights Movement, for example, and the second wave feminism. What I would encourage you to do is to have a look at that clip, to pause the video, and just to make a brief summary of some of the things that come up. You could use these stems if you wish: what, when, where, why, just to help you give a brief overview. Next, we'll consider then the economic context, and this is really helpful for thinking about film production. There are really three main things that we want to know about in order to understand the economic context of the film industry. During the 60s then, where film has an increased competition from television. Televisions now are accessible to many people and they have them in their homes. So this is going to lead to a downturn in the number of cinema goers. The decline in cinema audiences then leads to the closure of many cinemas during this time, making it quite a difficult industry to find success within. And we also see changes to film production. We have what we call the emergence of new Hollywood, so a time in which new producers and directors are becoming well known for using different techniques, dealing with different subject matter, and creating films that are completely different to what we had seen prior to this in cinemas. Now, those three things on their own aren't going to give you enough information. So what I'm going to suggest now is that you undertake some further reading in order to give some depth to these topics. On Show My Homework, I've placed this document, and it goes through the historical and economic context of the 1960s. You want to do some active reading here, so either reading on a screen, on something like a Word document where you can highlight, or printing this off and annotating by hand. I'd like you to think about this as you go through. If there's any words that you don't know, try to pick them out to clarify their meaning. Make some notes, write down questions that you might have, tracking your thought process as you go. And finally, when you've read through, there are some questions to answer at the bottom of the page to consolidate your understanding. Once you've done your wider reading, a really good thing to begin to practice then is thinking about how you would write about this information. How could you apply what you've now learned in a way that shows your knowledge, but is also making a point really about Disney and Disney's success during this time. And one way to practice that is to use different sentence endings. So we use this quite a lot in English and media, the because, but, so. I would encourage you to try this out. That's the first step, really. So you'll start with the sentence stem. The 1960s saw a downturn in cinema audiences, and then you'll write 3 different endings to that sentence. So the first one is because. So you need to give a reason why. Why was it that fewer people were attending the cinema throughout this decade? The second one asks you to say but. Okay, so we're saying that it's almost a despite here. Despite the fact that audiences were in decline, what else was going on? What else happened, or did Disney do? And finally, the 1960s saw a downturn in cinema audiences, so here we're able to give a reason why Disney has maybe made a particular decision. So what did they do next in order to combat this? And again, you'll need to use your knowledge from that wider reading in order to have a go at these sentences. Another way to practice writing about context is to use some further sentence constructions. One that I use a fair amount is a despite sentence, and that is a good way of showing that you're applying the context. So despite the downturn in cinema audiences in the 1960s, Disney still had huge success with its animated features due to its unchanging target market. And again, there's quite a lot of thinking goes into that construction. I have to think about my reasoning and why, linking one bit of context with another idea about Disney. So I'd encourage you to spend a little bit of time playing around with those sentence constructions, and you can send me the examples that you've got, what you've done. I can give some feedback on them. And finally, if you want to see them in action, you want some examples, have a look at the Knowledge Organiser. I have written in there a brief summary of the economic and historic context, and use some of those sentence stems again to model how they might be useful in this way.